Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to be talking about one of those features that is very useful, yet also very annoying to actually use, and that is vendor prefixes. We're going to look at what are vendor prefixes, how to use them in CSS and JavaScript, as well as tips and techniques that you can use to make working with them somewhat tolerable, maybe even enjoyable. Who knows? So let's get started. So before we get to the implementation details of vendor prefixes, let's take a few steps back and just talk about what exactly are they? Why do we use them? Why do they even exist? And to explain that, we need to start at the very beginning of how a feature ends up getting made and put into the browser so that you and I can use them as part of the things that we create. So in an ideal world, there's an ideal scenario. You have your browser vendors. You have your Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Opera. You have all the vendors of these browsers who come up with new features and they propose them to the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. This is kind of cool because the features they propose are things that they think are really cool and worth experimenting for, worth trying out for the future. And they're also based on things that you and I probably have complained about that they are addressing. This is kind of cool. And then what happens is once the features have been proposed, the W3C with the browser vendors, and along with a lot of experts that you and I can even be a part of if we want to, go through the design and come up with something that everyone is happy with. Come up with a design that satisfies all the needs of all the various browser vendors and any other interested parties and their requirements. So finally, step 3, the feature is ready, everyone is happy, and then the next version of all the major browser releases contain this feature in a way that is agreed upon and you and I can use it as part of our things. That's the ideal world. In reality, though, that is really not how things work. What really happens is this. Yes, the browser vendors do propose a new feature to the W3C, and those features are really cool. And the W3C, along with all these stakeholders, all the browser vendors, iterate on the feature design. All this is fine. Now here's the thing, though. Getting approval from that many people, from people who have often various constraints, is time consuming. It takes a long time for many features, especially some of the really cool ones that we often talk about, like animations, to go from something you propose to something that actually ends up getting implemented in a state that everyone is happy with. So what all the browser vendors do is, instead of waiting for the dust to settle, instead of waiting for consensus to be reached, they release these features in their proposed form in an experimental way. And what happens is these subsequent browser versions contain these features while the W3C is also deliberating on them. So things change. It's a moving target. And ultimately, the feature gets approved. Who knows how long that takes. And the next version of the browser will contain this feature that they've been having experimentally exposed to users now in its final form. So really the takeaway is this, is that you have a state where the feature exists in a way that is experimental, and then for a much longer period of time, have the feature in a form that is final. It's a final form of the feature. So a solution that we need is a graceful way to designate features as being experimental and to designate features as being final. And the solution that everyone has zeroed in on is what's known as vendor prefixes. So vendor prefixes are a way for you to clearly indicate, for the browser vendors to clearly indicate that some of these features aren't ready for prime time. And the way they mark these features is by prefixing them by the appropriate browser extension. Moz for Firefox, WebKit for Chrome and Safari, MS for Internet Explorer, and O for Opera. And then once the feature has been approved, these prefixes are just removed. Great. So now that we have a high-level overview of what vendor prefixes are and how they got there, let's move forward and talk a little bit about how to actually use them. Let's start with CSS. And to help highlight vendor prefixes, I'm going to pick on the transform property, because this property is a great example of something that was deliberated on by the W3C for quite some time. During that time, experimental versions of this property were available in almost every browser, and ultimately, pretty recently, it was officially accepted. So all the latest browsers today accept this property without any vendor prefixes required. So the way I would represent the transform property in my CSS is as follows. I will start off with the assumption that the property is officially accepted. So I have the transform property and the value that goes directly after it. And notice that the transform property is specified with no prefix under the assumption that this value has been accepted. And then to basically maximize the number of browsers that can view content that is using the transform property, I now go down the list and specify the WebKit version, the Mozilla version, the Microsoft version, and the Opera version to ensure that if this style rule is being viewed on an older browser that doesn't support the transform property natively, the appropriate vendor-specific version, the experimental version, will get picked. And the nice thing is, despite there being 5 properties with the exact same value, only one of them will really get recognized depending on what version of the browser you're actually viewing it on. So there's some unnecessary markup, which, as you'll see shortly, goes to one of the reasons why I dislike this, but the end result is your users will see a Translate 3D transform with the vertical position, in this case, reduced by 350 pixels. Which of these gets applied depends on the browser, but nothing really for us to worry about since that was handled by the vendor prefix. So in CSS, not only can the properties be vendor prefixed, so can the values. And one of the great examples of a property that even during its experimental stage kept changing dramatically was the flexbox. The flexbox property that you specify in the display to allow yourself to have better control over how elements are positioned and arranged. So just like before, I have a display property and the value set to flex. And this time around, notice that I prefixed the values themselves. So I have WebKit flex, Moz flex, MS flex, and OFlex. And these are again ways of ensuring that on older browsers, which in this case is almost all of them since the flex property is still being deliberated on, we'll be able to view the flex property with whatever particular details that the browser vendor decided to implement. So 2 ways of doing this. Properties can be vendor prefixed, so can the values. But now the thing is, as I mentioned earlier, this is really verbose. I don't like having CSS having the exact same value multiple times, and the reason is simply because it adds bloat. Your download size increases a bit, and also if you want to make a minor change to something, you have to go through and change a lot of things all over the place. And that is just frustrating, it's error prone, it's just busy work. And this is not actually, the worst part about it. Let me show you a more extreme example that is still very realistic of what I'm going to be showing. So here I have example.html, and what I have here is I have declared 2 animations. And notice animation is one of those properties that is also very, very new. So I have it animation name, specified just like before, where I'm assuming there are no vendor prefixes required because I'm future-proofing this. And then I have -ms animation, -ms animation, -Mozilla, Opera, WebKit. All the vendor prefix equivalents are basically taking up this much of my markup. And this looks bad, but this is not the worst of it. The thing is, you can also vendor prefix things like keyframes. And for something new like animation, even the add keyframe rules are vendor prefixed. So these set of lines right here are actually now duplicated once for Internet Explorer, once for Firefox, once for WebKit, and once for Opera, with the appropriate vendor prefixing being done internally for the properties and their values as well. So basically, the bulk of this CSS, almost 80% of what you see here, is there just to allow older browsers to see what's going on. So one way to work around the large amount of CSS that you end up finding in your document is to use a third-party library that I call prefix free. And let me bring it up in the browser. Prefix free is a very simple JavaScript file. All you're doing is you're writing your CSS without any vendor prefixes, adding this really small, around 2 kilobyte JavaScript file into your page, and this script file takes care of going through your document, going through your CSS and HTML, finding any inline styles or style rules that you have defined, and making them work with the vendor prefixes without you having to write all of them yourself. It's a very simple, very effective way of you essentially writing something that looks something like this, where you just specify the property without the vendor prefix, And at runtime, though, the library takes care of providing all the values for all the other browsers as well. It's a really simple way, and if you're doing anything in CSS that requires using vendor prefixes, I highly recommend you do this. As you saw earlier, there's just no point in having that much code, that much markup that is basically being duplicated. It just makes everyone's lives much more complicated. But see, using this, we get the benefit of clean markup, value specified only once for all these properties, and the end result is, though, the most number of people can actually view the content. That's pretty cool. So that's the CSS part of things. That's basically where we saw how you can use vendor prefixes as part of CSS properties and values, as you saw with the flexbox. Now, the thing is, the idea behind vendor prefixes, the goal of having experimental features that you want people to try out before it's been officially accepted, is not unique to CSS. It also affects JavaScript. So we're going to take a jump forward and look at how to deal with vendor prefixes in a world where you are writing all the code yourself. So this is going to be pretty fun. So there are two things in JavaScript that are really affected by vendor prefixes. The first thing is functions. And to highlight this example, I'm going to be using my favorite function of all, which is request animation frame. So this is a function that allows you to create animations very efficiently, and it is very new. And it's new enough where some browsers do recognize the officially sanctioned version of it, which is window.request animation frame. But for certain browsers, especially older ones, you need to prefix it. You need to specify window.moz request animation frame, window.webkit request animation frame, or window.ms request animation frame for Internet Explorer. So notice how I'm actually ensuring the right version works. And it's pretty simple. I'm simply using the OR operator. And what I'm saying is this, is if window.request animation frame exists, then this expression evaluates to true, and nothing else needs to run. The request animation frame variable gets a pointer to window.request animation frame, and then I can use it like I would any other function. If for whatever reason you're an older browser and this function does not work, the appropriate vendor-specific version will kick in instead. But the nice thing is, the end result is the request animation frame variable will point to the appropriate vendor-specific version of request animation frame, without you really having to keep track of that, in the rest of your code. And all that is made really simply possible by this window object returning a null or undefined when you're trying to access a function that doesn't exist. And the nice thing is also, this is the easiest part of dealing with vendor prefixes in JavaScript. The next one is going to be a little bit more involved, and I'm going to give some background information as part of it. So the other big part you're going to encounter vendor prefixes is in trying to access vendor prefixed CSS properties in JavaScript. So just like before, I'm going to pick on the transform property again, and this time I want to set the transform property in JavaScript. There are two ways you can do this. The style object on any element is basically a collection of properties. So I can specify the CSS property using the array notation, style bracket transform, and have it equal my particular CSS value. Or I can use the style dot notation and dot into the transform property and specify the value again. The end result in both of these cases is identical, but there is a major downside to this approach though. I'm only targeting the transform property. If I'm on an older browser that recognize the transform property, but only in its vendor prefix state, just mentioning transform will not work. I need to specify the equivalent of ms transform, o transform, moz transform, webkit transform. You can imagine that it's going to be a lot of lines of code. It will look something like this. And like I mentioned right here, don't do this. Do not write many lines of code, because just like before, this works, but any change you make, any modification needs to be done, needs to be duplicated, and the more lines of the same material you have, the more error-prone your code gets, the more fragile it gets. So what I'm going to be proposing is that you use a piece of script that you're going to create that handles some of this stuff for you. I should mention that Prefix Free, the wonderful library that I showed you guys earlier about how to not have to write all the vendor prefix versions of your CSS for your content, it only works in markup. It does not work in JavaScript. So the approach we're going to take is very similar to what you saw right here. We're going to check if a value exists, and if it doesn't, we're going to keep checking until the right value hits. At that point, we know what the appropriate value to pass in to the rest of your code will be. So the way we're going to do this is pretty simple. So for the transform property, we know there are 5 variations. There's transform, there's WebKit transform, MOS transform, MS transform, and O transform. These 5 versions. Depending on the browser you're on, only one of these will actually turn out to exist. For most new browsers, the first one, item.style bracket transform, will be all that you need, and everything else will be invalid, doesn't exist. But on older browsers, if you're on, let's say, Safari or Chrome, the WebKit transform option will be what gets hit. Or in older versions of Internet Explorer, MS transform, or in Opera, O transform. So we have a way of mentally thinking about this problem where we try to eliminate which of these values do not exist, and the one that remains is the vendor prefix version we want to carry throughout the code. Conceptually, it's pretty simple, and our code maps similar to that. Let me jump back into Visual Studio. Let me switch to transform.js, this property. So what I just described to you right now, I have represented in code. I have this transform variable. It's an array. This array contains 5 values: transform, MS transform, WebKit transform, MOS transform, and O transform. These are the 4 vendor prefix versions, and the non-vendor prefix version that I talked about earlier, that's the one you see right here. Well, if I get back to that part right here. Where was I? Yes, as you see right there. So what I'm doing here is identifying them in an array, and then I create another variable called transform property, and I pass this array into something called getSupportedPropertyName, to this function. And what this function does is pretty simple. It loops through every item in our array, and it checks if that value exists on a style object, which I'm just checking right off of our body element. If that value exists, that means that depending on the browser or depending on the version of the browser I'm on, one of these values is valid, and I return that. And if the value does not exist, which is very likely on 4 out of 5 of these were not going to exist, we just keep going through the list until we find the appropriate value. So, which is why if you look at how I'm actually using it in the end, the transform property gets a pointer to the appropriate vendor prefix version of the property, and then I ultimately just carry that value over and assign it to my style object, which is in this line right here, item.style bracket, and the value returned by the transform property could be transform, or it could be any of these vendor prefix versions, and it all depends on the browser you're on. The end result is my item, which is whatever element is represented by this query selector, is going to have the transform where it's going to be rotated by 45 degrees. That's pretty cool, and you can always add more properties. It's a nice little helper function, and like I mentioned here, you can actually go to this URL directly and see it in the browser and see a more copy and paste friendly version. Videos are not exactly the most convenient things for that kind of work. All right, so now let's go ahead and continue off from where we left off. We finish this here. So essentially, vendor prefixes, they're annoying. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. It's one of those things where in hindsight, I'm pretty sure if people knew, the browser vendors knew of some of the issues people ran into with this, something different might have been employed. But ultimately, there are solutions to make them somewhat digestible. So my best advice is learn to embrace them. You can't avoid them. You're going to have to live with them. So might as well learn to use libraries like Prefix Free to simplify your CSS, and then use some of the simple techniques I showed you, the 2 techniques I showed you for making these vendor prefixes work in JavaScript. And with that, to learn more about this, just go to Krupa.com, search for vendor prefixes. I have 2 articles that I like to talk about all the time, which is one on vendor prefixes in JavaScript, where that's the code, that's a URL you saw in the code earlier, where you see the example that I showed you in a few moments earlier. And I'll also talk about prefix-free and then include the gigantic animation example, which really drives the point home about how verbose vendor prefixes make your CSS. If you have any questions, just comment in here or go to the forums. And as always, you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, and you're already on YouTube, so subscribe to me if you haven't subscribed yet. And of course, as always, if you like to learn more about vendor prefixes and how they're used, especially in something that is as cutting edge as animation, my book, Animation in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, doesn't spend a lot of time on vendor prefixes, but everything you see there actually uses prefix-free, and it also uses the JavaScript tips I showed you for animating all the various properties in JavaScript that are not natively supported by the browsers. You find on Amazon and paperback and Kindle editions. All right, I will see you guys next time.